the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today I'm in the presence of my friend and colleague, Aerin, from, I think you say it, Toronto?
Yeah, Toronto. Like, it's just like a bunch of N's.
Yes. And my favorite thing to introduce everyone to you about your work in the world of astrology is you're a musician.
Yes.
So tell us more about the album that you've just created.
Yeah, so my project is called Queen of Swords, which is obviously a tarot card, not an astrology thing. And you would be amazed how many tarot card band names are taken up by metal bands. Like, I had no idea until I was like landing on a band name and I'm like, oh, all the major arcana are metal bands. Interesting. So it's called Queen of Swords, and the Year 8 album that I just put out is the second album that I've done with this project. And so I called it Year 8 because a lot of the record was recorded during an 8th house perfection year, but I think calling an album 8th house perfection year is a little more confusing and it rolls off the tongue a little less than Year 8.
I don't think it rolls off the tongue at all.
It does not. And everything would be like auto-correcting to like perfection year and,
right,
you know, be a disaster.
So when I saw that, I felt like it also resonates with the Venus cycle because of the 8-year synodic cycle and the sort of subtext of loss that actually attends to that loss of connection.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I actually hadn't even thought about it that way, but that's very true. And the cycle of Venus has been a very important symbolism for me as an astrologer and as a person and just in my own work. And the sort of process of descent and return feels very relevant to the record as well. So that's such a beautiful connection that I hadn't even thought of.
See, the art's just channeling through you. And then also, I just want to recognize your role as a community builder with the Venus Fest. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project that you founded in your city?
Yeah. Speaking of cycles, I started Venus Fest 7 years ago. So it's been a Saturn quarter. And it was originally meant to create more space for underrepresented artists. So a lot of the initial intention of the festival was about gender parity and bringing more equitable gender parity into the music industry, particularly for trans artists. But as the festival evolved, it was about parity and accessibility on all levels and not just with respect to gender. So I started that in late 2016. And I'm in the process actually of stepping back as the AD right now, and there's someone else carrying forward with it. So it's really beautiful because it's kind of grown into its own being and flourished in its own way. And as a proud mom, I can now kind of step back and let it take shape in, you know, wherever it's going to go next.
Amazing. Well, so let's go back to your start in AstrologyLand. What was the first entry point for you in astrology in terms of book culture? What was the first book you read?
The first full book that I read was something called, I might even mess up the name now. It was like only astrology book you'll ever need.
Yeah, there's two kinds. There's a yellow one and a blue one.
I had a yellow one.
With an interactive CD-ROM.
That was it.
Right? Like, we're talking,
yes.
What year did this book land on your lap?
Oh gosh, 2008,
okay.
I think. Prior to that, my only really experience of astrology was sun sign horoscopes in the paper and stuff like that. But when I was a very little kid, my mom had gone and gotten these like automated readings for my brother and I, and they were essentially like chart printouts with like a little paragraph for each planet and house placement, like mini automated delineations. It was like the original AI astrology reading or something like that. And I would just like sit in my room as a kid with this thing and like pore over it. It was so fascinating to me. And then I went for a reading with my then to become mentor around that time, 2008. And I really did not know what astrology actually was until I had my chart done. And I was like, what was that? Like, what just happened? And so it prompted a whole snowball effect where I then went out and I was like, okay, I must learn. I must understand this. So it was a fantastic 101 book to read, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. What was the experience like for you having that first consultation?
It was very surprising. I was raised in a house where like mysticism is not that weird. So it was around me to some extent. Like my parents are both very spiritual Jews. And so there were tarot cards in my house. They were interested in astrology. They were of the generation of people in the 80s that would go to like holotropic breath workshops and stuff like that. Like they were really interested in all these like healing modalities that were resurfacing. And so to some extent, it was a part of my life from the very beginning. But then naturally, like as a teenager, I also rebelled against it. And I was, very hardcore atheist for a while. I was studying philosophy and really into like hard existential philosophy. Like my spirituality went in a very different direction. So at the time that I actually went for that first reading, I was not very open or interested to really understand what astrology was. In my mind, it was just, fluff or something that wasn't really real. Mm-hmm. And then having the reading with Julie Simmons, who later became my mentor, I just was quite speechless walking away because I was like, well, I don't know exactly what that is, but it worked. And she was able to articulate things about myself that I couldn't even really give words to, but that felt so fundamentally true. And so it really piqued my curiosity because I was like, yeah, I don't know what that is, but there's something very real to it. Like, obviously there's something going on here.
Right. Like, how did you do that? And
yeah, exactly. And things that she said to me in that initial reading that at the time I was like, that one I don't know about. And then in the years following, like as life continued to unfold and I grew up a little bit, I was like, oh my God, she was right. And I didn't even know that at the time.
Wow. Now that you're on the other side of that consult table, do you have a feeling from the people that you speak with that you're delivering that same kind of wow factor and initiating them into what astrology can do? Or what is that sort of turning the table like for you at this point in your career?
I think that is one of my favorite things about being a consulting astrologer is there's a sense of awe that happens a lot of the time that feels very shared with my clients when we're talking about timing techniques and then the experiences that they're going through. Both of us are there with this kind of awe at the way that things are unfolding and the alignment through which they're unfolding. And my curious brain has gone off and learned as much as I can about like what that is, like what's actually happening there. But then on a deeper level, it's really beyond me. And I just find it like so humbling and awe-inspiring to be in a constant reminder with other people that our lives are part of this ecosystem and that we're deeply connected to and affected by this like incredible ecosystem that we live in.
Yeah. I love that you put it in terms of ecosystem. That's truly a beautiful way of thinking about that interconnectivity as opposed to something like maybe clockwork, which is a little more mechanistic and industrial, right? You're talking about a sort of mycelial, rhizomatic connection of Like, how is it that the synastry with the people you see comes up, that you're getting charts of the same kind in a certain season, and then it sort of flips and you have others, And so you talking to them is in that same relationship.
Yeah. And it's funny because it is also like clockwork. Like, it's like, you can't make this stuff up. Like, people run on the schedule of astrology, and whether they know about the astrology has nothing to do with that. We're kind of like going in this clockwork track, but then it is also, I love that image as well, like the mycelial network of connection that's there in the same way that mushrooms are talking to each other through that mycelial network. Like, there's this kind of unspoken correlation or synonymous unfolding with our lives and then everything that's happening around us.
Right. And it captures a little bit of the precognitive that I heard you speaking to. Like, when we look, we can realize it's there, and it's there regardless of whether we look,
Yeah. And I love that too. There's one of the first like big workshops I ever did was with Noel Till in like 2009 or 2010 or something. He came to speak for Astrology Toronto. And there was something that he said that will always stay with me, where he was like, someone asked him how he responds to skeptics. His general answer was like, well, I don't really care. People can think whatever they think, and that's not my problem. But he said, astrology is not something that I believe in. It's something that I know about. And that always stayed with me because that feels true. You can believe in things, but to me, astrology is not a belief system. It's just something that if you know that it's happening, you know that it's happening. And then it happens even if you don't know about it.
Right. And speaking like clockwork, like a true Capricorn, Noel Till was born and died on the same day. Right. So
I didn't know that. That's on schedule. There you go.
On schedule, right? Yeah, I know. I love that. And I have a daughter. She's also a Capricorn, and she was born, like, they looked at, the nurses were in the hospital like, did she read the manual? And I'm like, she was born on the solstice. So it's like, yeah, she did. She's a Capricorn now. Could have been a Sag a couple hours ago, but no.
Wild. I love that. She was on schedule. She was just waiting for her birth time window.
Oh, totally.
Like, and now.
I think into a certain, I mean, as much as, like, what is it like to be an astrologer mom, right? You're just like, okay, what are we going to do? Which moon, and it's like, nope. As much as you try to plan anything, they choose. They do.
They choose. And, I've known people who go to astrologers to elect C-section births. And then the baby comes early and has a different chart anyways. And, it's like
everything's going as planned. And then someone has a low blood pressure. The doctor's late. And, it's like things can happen. But I also want to acknowledge the non-human birth of your Venus Fest and also your albums as like entities that are really, creation is more than just making human beings. So that experience you had, I want to validate that, because I can sense that it's, because of how much it is like living beyond you. That's a true experience of giving life to something. So that's a really cool thing that you've done.
Yeah, it does really feel that way. Like when I hear gestational parents describing like, that little thing was in my body and now is out in the world, and I have just like an organ running around in the world. It really does feel the same with Venus Fest and with albums, because it's something that lived in me for so long, like as a thing in my being. And I really do feel them as alive entities in their own way. Like Venus Fest always felt like a being that sort of arrived in my life. And then we were in relationship for this long. And, I was here to kind of steward that being into the world. And now it's alive in its own way. So it is quite similar, I think. Just there's not like a little body that is dependent on me in the same way.
Yeah, but it's a non-human entity. And I think that's a brilliant, way of engaging in the world, and very true perhaps also to the Venus placements in its own architecture astrologically.
Yes.
Do you want to spend your professional life telling people when to have sex? My name is Nicholas Matz-Alsop, and I'm the author of Fertility Astrology. Join me online this fall for the Fertility Astrology Intensive. This course is a first of its kind, consolidating all the astrological techniques you will need to be a world-class astrology and fertility consultant. I'm here to enhance your astrology. We are astrologers who want to make the most of the situation for yourself and your client. And we're going to share with you the things that have worked in my practice in the last 20 years. At the end of 14 weeks, you're going to be really confident when somebody asks you, do you think there's a chance I'm going to get pregnant this year? You'll have something real to tell them. But especially come. let's talk about sex, baby.
To learn more and register for the September 9th start date, please visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. Very cool. So I'm going to stick you in a very remote place on Earth, and I'm going to ask you to pack your bag, and you get to have an ephemeris. Everybody gets the ephemeris. For those listening who don't know what that is, that's the collected tables of the planetary positions for however long the ephemeris is worthy for. Sometimes it's a century, sometimes it's 50 years, but it's basically the collected data for any chart you want to cast in that time period. So that's kind of a fundamental, right? But if you could take 3 other books with you, just to keep it simple, what would you put in that bag?
So I think for this question, one of my answers is that I wanted to take with me the Vettius Valens Anthology, but part of that is because I've just started reading it.
Oh.
I was like, okay, well, I'm going to take this because I want to finish it.
Yeah.
But also, I think that a lot of what's in that anthology, this is like the Mark Riley translation that Chris Brennan recently supported. And so at the time that we're recording this, it didn't come out too long ago. So I've just started reading it. But I think a lot of what's in this anthology and in Valens texts are really foundational to so much of the astrology that we practice, whether that is modern or traditional. So I find it to be a really supportive resource text because there's a lot to just go back to in there. And then there's also a lot of stuff that would keep me really busy on a desert island, like the more abstract calculations that might take.
Oh, you mean the part where he says you can perfect from anything?
Exactly. And I'm like, well, okay, if I had nothing else to do and I could sit there perfecting from like literally everything in the chart and doing annual, monthly, daily, hourly, minutely perfections from everything in the chart, that would be just like a fascinating way to keep myself busy on a desert island.
And maybe also to find out when you can get off and how.
Exactly. And maybe when you're going to die on the desert island, depending on if you have that knowledge. But
yeah. The other interesting thing about that text was it was available for free as a PDF for the longest time. And Chris just produced that as another book in his press, Amor Fati. And so it's neat that then now it has this paper quality that you can just like stick it in a bag and run without electricity, right? And so that's a neat iteration of this creation. What else would you put in your bag?
I would bring Demetra George's Mysteries of the Dark Moon.
Okay.
This is something that I read earlier on in my astrology study. I think it was one of the many books that my mentor, who I've mentioned, Julie Simmons, just gave me one day when she was sort of cleaning out her library. And this book impacted me very deeply from an astrological perspective, but also just from the perspective of a person, a woman living in the world, because it spoke to a lot of how I strive to approach my life, which is with respect for the dark moon, essentially, and with respect for the dying phases and the loss of light and the entry into the underworld. These are all things that have been really significant parts of my own life and my own journey, and coming to understand them as part of a larger cycle and part of a larger context of human experience has been profoundly meaningful. So it's such a beautiful book from that perspective. And then also there's a lot of really inspiring myth and like specific goddesses that she will connect with the dark moon phase. Yeah, it just really spoke to me. And I think I was like in my early 20s or something. And it was a good time to read that book.
Very good. Yeah, it's not a common choice for a Demetra book because she has so many good ones. But as somebody who's, working in the world the way that you have brought your astrology into the world, it's nice to see that you're going to remind people that this one exists.
Yeah. And I thought about your questions a lot before our conversation because the things that I'd want on a desert island that from a technical perspective, like further my astrological foundation and support my education and growth as an astrologer and consulting person. But then there are the things that I would want with me because they connect me from a soul perspective with like sense of purpose and shared experience in the world. And so I tried to sort of cover all the bases there. And this for me is very much like a book with very deep soul meaning, even though Demetra has so many other incredible books that go in a lot of very different directions, and many of them more technical than this one.
Right.
But to me, like, technique is only a portion of astrology, and then there's a lot more to it.
Yeah. I will never forget being in the Bahamas with her for the Sky Conference in 2015. And we were sitting on this rumbly bus trying to get to the retreat location. And at that point, I was working with Kepler College, trying to, be a part of the project of legitimizing astrology in academia.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a part of the early faculty at Kepler. And she turns to me and she goes, "Jenn, don't you think astrology is more of a vocation?" We had a long conversation at that point about how, it's a little bit more like a mystery school or a priesthood that you're called to that has a shrouded quality to it. That's not necessarily meant for just devouring because you want to get a degree in it, right? It's not about that kind of open knowledge. It's more of a private kind of knowledge.
Oh, yes, that speaks to me very deeply. And it is interesting in light of that so many of the foundational astrology texts have been kind of shrouded in mystery for like hundreds and hundreds of years now, that, they haven't been accessible to most people. And so finding our way into astrology has been a little bit like feeling our way in the dark. There's obviously a resurgence of so many of these beautiful foundational texts happening now, but it has really been like a mystery school. And I think that learning all the technique in the world doesn't necessarily make one an astrologer. It can, but it doesn't always. Like you said, there's a vocation there. There's something else that's alive around all of the information itself.
Yeah, that's just one of my favorite things about being in it so long, is like seeing these various positions one can take within the community and also within one's relationship to astrology itself. Much like the moon and the dark moon, which is not seen as much as the full moon, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. And even for you, like as a person who's like a steward of astrological education and of the libraries of astrology that holds so much education, but then there's so much else that's in there for you. That's not just like, okay, well, these are all the different books that come from the different streams. Like there's a larger connection, a larger system there.
Trying to speak mycelial to the unborn people who are about to come to this planet. So speaking of generations, I actually already, like, pro tip, I already know the third book, but what's the third book that's in your
Spoiler alert.
Yes.
So yeah, this one is probably familiar to a lot of astrologers, but Richard Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche, which was also one of my early reads in my astrology journey that was recommended to me by a friend. This was a desert island pick because I think it's something that always gives me new information. Like I've read it 3 times now, and there's always something new that comes to light for me every time I read it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's one of those books that it's not just like you finish it, you've got the information and that's that. Like it has an aliveness to it, which speaks to what the book itself is about. Like it's kind of a mundane astrology book. Like it's looking at the larger cycles throughout history. But I also love that it's written from the perspective of someone who is not an astrologer to begin with. So it's written from the perspective of someone who is discovering the meaning and richness and that awe-inspiring feeling of astrology through the process of doing the research that he did for this book. And so you're kind of getting like the wonderment of starting to peel back the veil and see the inner workings and the inner mechanisms of like these large human cycles throughout history from the perspective of someone who's making that discovery with you as you go through the book. So I really love it for that reason. And I also work a lot with planetary cycles in my own practice. So it's something that really speaks to my own areas of interest and focus.
Very cool. So how long were the intervals between the 3 readings?
So that first book was probably 2008. And then the other 2 I read somewhere in the 3 to 4 years after that. And I will say, compared to some other astrologers, I'm a slow reader because I will think about things for a long time. And my brain is a little bit like a water table. So I kind of need to let things like filter through the sediment and the layers of the water table to reach that kind of like deep underground place of knowing. I'm a little less mercurial than some people who will go through books at a more rapid speed. And then, it's just kind of in there. I love to think about things really slowly, but really deeply. And so I spaced out a lot of my astrology learning and reading in those early years because I was chewing it over. And in the meantime, going off and reading a lot of non-astrology books that helped me understand what this actually was, because I was so deeply curious, like, how does this work? So then I started, trying to get my hands on as much comprehensive quantum physics as possible. I'm not a scientist, so, the stuff that was written for people who are not inherently scientists, and trying to understand a little bit about the interconnectedness of this system that we live in. So that was part of my astrology education too in the earlier years.
To add nuance to that, how much time did you take off between reading Cosmos and Psyche each time?
Many years.
Many years. Okay.
Like, I think 5 years between readings-ish.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I'm just thinking about the scale of time that is covered in Tarnas's book, and then thinking about you as perhaps a planet. You're transiting the book itself, or the book might be transiting you, but there's this kind of alternate position, so that when you go back in 5 years later and then 5 years after that, of course you're going to see different things come to light, because your own astrological moment has shifted too. I mean, all the accumulated experience has shown, like at first maybe this fact came through, but now at 5 years later, these are the archetypes that really resonate. And then you just can keep going probably with this one forever, right?
Absolutely. I love that. And now I'm thinking, well, now it makes me want to go back and actually figure out when I read the book. But 5 years, if it was 5 years, I'm like, okay, so I waited 2 Mars cycles between every reading. So there's something about my relationship to Mars and this book, maybe that's part of my own cycle with it.
I love that you're doing that in your head. That's awesome. Yeah. No, I had this thing when I was just before I started learning astrology, but I picked up Albert Camus' book, The Stranger. Mostly because Robert Smith from The Cure said that it was his favorite book. So I was like, well, I love The Cure, so I've got to read this. And I read it the September of my freshman year of high school. And then I decided that I would reread it every year in September until, like, taking a vitamin, I kind of forgot one year.
Yeah.
But every year I would reread it in September, about, I think, like 5 years in a row, something like that. And I would just see different things in the story each time.
That's so interesting. I mean, September, I immediately think of the autumn equinox, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. And there's something of that, like in that book too, where there's like a crossing over.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of transitional energy. So that's really beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. I think I was just trying to be a cool goth kid, though. It wasn't like motivated by anything else. But yeah, okay. So if you were going to now suggest to somebody who's just entering the field, right, and they want to have something to read, and you're pointing them to sort of a resource that they can use to become a better astrologer, which books would you recommend to the beginner?
On this list, I put Chani Nicholas's You Were Born for This, because I think it's a fantastic 101 dip your toe in book, as well as something that, has a lot of insight for people who are deep into their astrology study. Like, I think there's a lot in there. I would imagine that in this conversation that you're having with people, there might be a lot of people who say Chris Brennan's Fate and Fortune, or, Demetra's Volume 1. And those came to mind, but for me, those might land a little better for people if they already have some grasp on astrology. I feel that they would be difficult books to read for someone who's like really at a starting out place. So I love Chani's book because you don't need to know anything going into it. But coming out of it, I think she provides a very comprehensive walk through mostly like your sun, moon, and rising. And you get a little bit of a sense of like, okay, well, my sun is in this sign, in this house, and it aspects these planets. And then you get that for sun, moon, and rising. And that's already like a lot of information right there. So I think it's a really wonderful starting point. And then also she's framing it from a kind of healing perspective in a way, which is part of what I love about Chani's work. Like, she's become the sort of voice of the queer astrology generation because it's given voice to people's experiences that have otherwise been silenced. And so I think that she writes from a really deep and compassionate perspective too.
Very cool. Very cool. Are there any others you would recommend too for the beginner?
Yes. So this one might seem a little more obscure to some people, but my friend, mentor, colleague, chosen granny, who I've mentioned a few times, Julie Simmons, she's also a Toronto astrologer. She was the first person I had a reading with, and then I went on to study with her as my first teacher. And now she and I work together, which is a great honor for me. And she has a few books that she's put out, but one of those first astrology books that I read was a book that she wrote called Astrology's 12 Great Myths, The Twisted Archetypes of a Dominator Culture. It's only available as an ebook right now, but it's, I think, like a super cheap purchase. It's like $1 or something like that online. And I have a version of it and made a little binder of it.
Is that the logo she has? There's 2 circles crossing each other to make a Vescapiscus. Is that the logo that she's put on the book?
Exactly.
That's the logo for the podcast.
Is it really?
Yes. Yes.
I think this is actually Julie's like symbol that she's been, maybe logo, but it's
a common symbol. It's also on MasterCard. I mean, it's people can find it lots of places. 2 circles crossing each other.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a nice little synchronicity.
Well, because if you defamiliarize your eyes or you sort of like soften your gaze, it creates this nice almond shape that can be resonant with so many feminine things.
Very true. Yeah. And I think for her, it probably has something to do with the triple goddess and maiden mother crone and all that. But yeah, this book really impacted me, and I think is also a fantastic starting point because it's another book that's written for people who don't need to know anything about astrology. So you can walk in cold and walk away with a lot. But she's essentially going through the 12 zodiac signs and giving you a traditional myth for each one. But the reason I love Julie's take on it is that she's also, from a critical and holistic perspective, examining the dominator patriarchal culture that a lot of the myths come out of and offering a different perspective. So for instance, like the first sign in the book, she starts with Aries and she's using the myth of Jason and Medea. And I think from a lot of perspectives, Medea is really like a demonized sort of evil character in a story that's about Jason, the hero. And so Jason's this like heroic Aries archetype. But she offers a perspective of like hero for what or hero for who, and the importance of Medea's role in the myth of the hero. And so it gave me a whole other kind of foundation for my study in astrology, which was not like just this means this and this does this, but to actually think about the context and culture from which a lot of our understanding comes out of, and to always hold that context in mind when interpreting and delineating, which is something that I do with great caution in my love of traditional astrology. I also hold that it comes from a very particular time and place in the world that may or may not feel resonant with where we are right now.
That's amazing. I love that you have that in your lineage and that you're carrying that torch even now and bringing it also to everybody listening here. So thank you for sharing all of your insights and all of the books that have touched your work and practice and heart and soul. And I can't wait to have you back.
Thanks, Jen. It's so nice to chat with you. And I really appreciate this podcast. It's such a wonderful way to explore astrology together. So thank you for hosting.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.